Thank you for your patience. Birchfield, I'm an associate professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech, and I'm the co-director of our Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. And we're very happy today to be able to co-sponsor the last event of Georgia Tech's series of events in celebration of International Education Week. And we're extremely privileged to have a keynote speaker to wrap our International Education Week up here, Mr. Geoffrey Harris. So thank you for your patience. We'll get underway, and I would just like to keep my introductory remarks brief so that we can turn the floor over to Mr. Harris. I had the privilege of meeting Mr. Harris actually at an International Studies Association conference. And when was that? Last spring in San Diego, and I had delivered a paper entitled "The European Union, the Conscience of the European Parliament, the Conscience of the Union," and it attracted Geoffrey's attention because, if you've read a bit of his bio sketch on the flyer, he has been a lifelong public servant of the European Parliament. He's had over 2 decades career with the European Union, and most recently has been the head of the Human Rights Unit in within the European Parliament. And as of July this year, he moved from Brussels to our capital, Washington, D.C., where he now is serving as the deputy head of the European Parliament's Liaison office with the U.S. Congress. So he's had a very big transition in his career after over 2 decades living in Brussels, the heart of Europe. So I've learned a lot of things about Geoffrey's career, but this summer I had the opportunity to take our study abroad students on our program there to meet with him and the executive director of Human Rights Watch Europe for a fascinating seminar discussion on the role that the European Union plays in promoting human rights. And that's going to be the subject of his talk today, but I've learned a lot more about him recently, and one thing that I'll share with you quickly is, first of all, I think most people know that if you've watched British politics and if you knew anything about the British role in the European Union, they've been one of the more skeptical members, let's say. And certainly the debates that are unfolding reflect that. But I can tell you that Geoffrey Harris, as a citizen of the United Kingdom, is nonetheless a quite convinced European and an advocate for a stronger European Union. But I should say also, when we met at this conference, he's also an author and is a very objective thinker about the state of the European Union today. And I just learned that he published a book which is still very timely, by Columbia University, The Dark Side of Europe. I might not have the title just right, but he, in this book, discussed how Europe also offers opportunities for skeptics and far-right critics of European integration. So we had a discussion about that, and I think he's very open to having a wide-ranging discussion during the Q&A. So we are so privileged to have Mr. Harris with us on the campus today to celebrate International Education Week. And I'd just like to say that thanks to the leadership of Amy Henry, unfortunately she's not in the room yet because she delivered us literally on the doorsteps of the library here, but Amy is the executive director of the Office of International Education, and I think it's because of her vision and leadership that Georgia Tech is as international a campus as it is today. Many of you probably saw that we were in the top 20 of the Times rankings, and part of that is attributed to the internationalization that our campus has experienced over the last decade. So, and I think Amy deserves a lot of credit for that and her staff at the Office of International Education. So thank you for helping us make this program possible today. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Geoffrey Harris to the podium.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I did tell Vicky where I was going to start my presentation about the role of the European Union as a promoter of human rights, but I'm going to trick her by starting somewhere else. On the 10th of December 1948, the members of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Very important historical event over 60 years ago, a totally different historical context. Many of the European countries still had colonies. Europe was just heading into the beginning of the Cold War, and of course it was only 3 years after the end of World War II, and a couple of years before the launching of the whole process of European integration, which began with the Schuman Plan and the Treaty of Paris. And people often overlook the context in which this whole process began. And of course, 10th of December is the day also which the Nobel Committee choose each year for the presentation of the Nobel Prize. So in the hometown, or well, they were the burial town at least, of Martin Luther King, one of the Nobel Prize winners, and in the state of the United States, the head of your state having himself been the recipient of the Nobel Prize a few years ago. I think I'd like to start by drawing to your attention the relevance of the choice of the Nobel Prize for this year, which is in fact the European Union. A choice which has led to some perplexity, and so why? The answer, I think, is that the European Union has a lot more achievements than people realize. Indeed, we can talk a little bit about the current problems of the integration process, but in fact it has been an extraordinary success. If we consider the time at which I'm talking about, around 1950, Korean War, division of Europe, a few years after the worst human loss of life in war in the history of the world, the Second World War, the achievement of a Europe which is basically peaceful, basically relatively prosperous, not the source of any international conflicts, had many conflicts raging nearby, but it's not Europe itself. The countries of Europe, which traditionally were at the heart of international rivalries, that Europe doesn't exist anymore. We actually do have an integrated and peaceful Europe. So in many ways, what appeared to be a dream, the European dream, as Rifkin called it, of those who were in the resistance movement, the anti-fascists, or people fighting in the Second World War and thinking how to reconstruct Europe afterwards, that dream has been achieved. And Europe, whether you call it whole and free, which is a rhetorical phrase from the Bush I era, certainly the enlargement process, which I had the honor of working on in the 1990s, has also been a remarkable success. Countries traditionally bent on mutual destruction, domination, now live and work together with conflicts and issues and problems, but in a peaceful environment governed by the rule of law, democracy, freedom of expression, elections, things which many, many people around the world still dream of and see as a very distant dream. So as we look at the current crisis and analyze what its implications are for the European Union's ability to project its values, we should always remember where we came from, whether it's in the 1940s, whether the period when Spain, Greece, Portugal, which have problems now, of course, but the problems quite different ones than the ones they faced when they had a very ruthless, fairly bloodthirsty series of dictators in those three countries. And when they overthrew those dictatorships, that was their ticket to joining the then European community. Similarly, when the Cold War ended, the process of enlargement continued, and countries which had almost disappeared off the map, such as Lithuania or whatever, Slovenia, regained their statehood legally and politically, and precisely in order to shore up their achievement, chose to join the European Union. Some of them also joined NATO as well, but the European Union, as an expression of their democratic destiny, that was their choice. And it's something we shouldn't overlook, because and we should also not overlook that these values we talk about, which inspired Václav Havel or Martin Luther King or whatever, they are universal values, not just because some bureaucrat says they're universal values, but because there is such a thing as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I say, Europe has many, many problems, but in terms of developing protection of the rights of its own citizens has made huge progress, and therefore, as is laid down in our treaties, these values which brought these countries together in the first place also should influence the values which the Union tries to enhance as part of its external relations. However, even looking forward optimistically to the Nobel Prize event on the 10th of December, we cannot overlook the fact that the European Union does at the present time face some quite substantial problems. There is a crisis of legitimacy, if you want to call it. Maybe in democracy there's always a crisis of legitimacy, because whoever in power has to stand for election in a few years' time. So that's not a particularly devastating. The issues, of course, are how to maintain the achievements in terms of democracy and stability, and in particular how to make a success of the flagship project which 17 of the countries signed up for, and others intend to join, namely the euro. Of course, the euro crisis you can analyze in terms of the structure, the Treaty of Maastricht, the criteria of the Growth and Stability Pact, but you could also see the euro crisis as a reflection of a changing balance of power in the world, and Europe and America together with their difficulties, or when they're going well, are no longer in a position to lay down the law in terms of values. We are increasingly challenged, both economically and politically, and as part of the economic success of China and others in Asia, these countries, Russia included, also seek to project an alternative, shall we say, interpretation of the Universal Declaration. Nobody will stand up and say, we're against human rights, we're against freedom of expression. But if you follow such things, quite an instructive thing to look at is the Human Rights Council. I'll say a word about that in a moment. But you have countries which purport to stand up for human rights, but actually they're redefining these rights in a way which serves regimes which actually deprive their own citizens of freedom of expression and the basic values of freedom and democracy that we take for granted. I would like to say also, by way of example, that alongside the Nobel ceremony in December, in the European Parliament each year there is always a similar prize award known as the Sakharov Prize. Again, the fact that it's called the Sakharov Prize, initiated in 1988, shows how far we have come, because Sakharov was at that time risking his life as a dissident in what was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, looking around the audience, I think that probably some of you weren't born when the USSR, if we talk about who was the main partner or rival of the United States at that time, was not China, was actually the Soviet Union. And so each year the European Parliament awards a similar human rights prize. It so happens that the lady that your Nobel Prize winning president is going to visit over the weekend, Aung San Suu Kyi, is also a recipient of the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize and the Nobel Prize. So these prizes just are illustrations of what I'm talking about, but the enormity of what it means to fight for freedom and democracy and to achieve it and then take it for granted is something which we as citizens of free countries shouldn't take for granted. So this year the Parliament will be awarding the Sakharov Prize to two people from Iran. I say an example of a country where people, as we know from the so-called elections there a few years ago, do not have the basic rights to choose their government, which we take for granted. So Europe has problems, that's my first point, but let us think where we came from and look at the environment around us and maybe be a little more proud of our achievements as we look to the future. Just a couple more words about this parallelism between the European integration process and the United Nations. During the Bush II period, the whole issue of the Human Rights Council was a divisive one between Europe and the United States. The United States decided not to take its place or to stand for election to the Human Rights Council, whereas under President Obama, the United States has been playing its part. The controversy, leaving aside the controversy inside America, but the difference of approach results from the fact that the member countries of the European Union have accepted the various treaties, controversial as they are, as an effective abandonment of part of their national sovereignty. That's what makes it controversial, that's what makes it different. And in the same vein, they have also enthusiastically supported the development of international law, international humanitarian law, whereas in the United States, your view of your sovereignty is slightly different, and so you're a lot less enthusiastic for international law, the United Nations conventions, although I was very pleased to notice that within the Congress a procedure is advancing for the United States to accede to the United Nations Convention on the rights of people with disabilities, which will be quite an important step. But on issues such as the International Criminal Court, other international conventions, the rights of the child, there the United States is in, shall we say, a minority position around the world, and it's a difference of approach, even if in terms, of course, of democracy, rule of law, Europe and America do have a great deal in common. But if you look at something like the Human Rights Council and even the United Nations generally, it is a kind of battlefield. In my opinion, it's a battlefield which should not be abandoned to those who do not support human rights. Countries, Libya was actually a member of the Human Rights Council at the time of the uprising against Colonel Gaddafi, which suggests that those critics of the Human Rights Council on the Republican side maybe have a point. How can a country like that get on to the Human Rights Council in the first place? And similarly, in the Security Council, we've seen what's happened in the case of Syria, where two of the permanent member states have refused to take a position with regard to the obvious repression underway in Syria. So, difference of approaches, yes. Basic values, the same, yes, as well. So, but the support of the United Nations is something which the European Union also considers one of the central points of its foreign relations. And indeed, as a result of the Lisbon Treaty, we have a more organized way of the European Union expressing itself within the United Nations. But this is the beginning of a process. We'll talk a bit about that, but it remains quite problematic. So the basic values were defined at the basis of the European Union. If you want to join the European Union, I think Georgia, if I'm not mistaken, would have a problem because of the death penalty. But there are certain criteria. So all the member states of the 27, 28, and in a few months' time, they have to have a fully functioning, open, democratic society. So the historical processes which have continued since the founding of the European community in the 1950s have enhanced the opportunities for Europe to stand up for these values. The colonies of Britain, France, Belgium were abandoned. In the 1970s, the European states fully engaged in what is called the Helsinki process, which sucked the Soviet bloc countries into some kind of discussion about human rights. In the 1990s, the European Union was ready to receive the new member states once the USSR collapsed. And of course, on the global stage, what happened in Eastern Europe and to some extent in Russia contrasted quite dramatically with what happened in China in 1989, where the chance of reform was nipped in the bud, if that's the right way of expressing what happened in Tiananmen. There was a complete different destiny for Europe than for China. The other big event which has changed the context in which Europe seeks to enhance its ability to stand up for human rights around the world, has, of course, been the events in the Arab world. Whether you call it the Arab Spring, whatever you want to call it, something has changed. Something has changed quite dramatically in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, Jordan. It's an unfolding process. It will have enormous implications for Israel, of course, but that has meant that the basic idea that values matter is much easier to get across, because a lot of people put the eye, well, maybe things are not as they should be in Egypt or Tunisia or whatever, but at least they've got stability and they're our friend and they help us in terms of guaranteeing security of Israel. The reality is that such an approach only produces the goods up to a point, and indeed can lead to a much more unstable situation once the inevitable challenge to autocracy comes about. So Europe is now operating not just in an enlarged Europe, but in a totally different neighborhood. North Africa and indeed the eastern countries present the main challenge for Europe to get its values across, because these are our neighbors, whereas you try to influence them in a certain direction to extend the whole idea of peaceful integration as far as possible. But it's a totally different context than the 1940s and 50s, but the basic idea that integration, open borders, the creation of a mutual independence in a way which favors everybody, it's basically a good idea. And indeed around the world, even in Southeast Asia, in South America, the idea of different kinds of regional integration with some kind of human rights element, both the ASEAN and the Organization of American States and the African Union have to some extent followed the European idea with some kind of economic integration, and as originally we had in the Council of Europe, a charter of fundamental rights. Of course, how far they advanced may be quite different, but the basic idea is very, very similar. So this European idea of peaceful integration based on human rights actually is a lot more attractive than we sometimes realize ourselves, and indeed precisely because of our current internal difficulties, we tend to overlook. Now, in the recent decades, I'm not going to give you the whole history of the process, but I'm trying to underline the relevance of and the right of the European Union, if you like, to try to enhance its values. It has no ability to force countries down a certain path, no military capacity to intervene for or against a particular regime action, such as Libya. Of course, that's a NATO action, but it is quite a different situation than a country occupying another in order to force it to adopt a certain kind of behavior. So in the last decades, I would just underline in structural terms two very, very big changes. One, which I dare say you have studied to some extent, the Lisbon Treaty, the latest in the series of treaties, probably not the last, by the way, which have, since the Treaty of Paris, carried forward the whole process of European integration. We now have a European Union with a president, with an executive commission, with a vice president who is charged with the representation of the European Union on foreign and security policy. We have EU ambassadors around the world, where it's no longer every 6 months the country representing the EU around the world changes. We have a structured role in the United Nations. So the structure of the European Union has changed profoundly as a result of coming to terms with being a much bigger union. Obviously, when it's a small group of 6, maybe even then they had their crises as it happens, but easier to function. But with 27, contrary to what might be described as the British view, that the more members you have, the less integration. In fact, the real experience has been the opposite, that the more members you have to introduce more majority voting and more substantial leadership positions in order to get anything decided and carried out. So, as was mentioned by Vicky at the beginning, I'm working in the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington with it's a European Parliament Liaison Office with the US Congress. Why do we have such an office? We have such an office because it has been noticed in the US that the European Parliament has a decisive say on all external agreements. Recently on the anti-counterfeit trade agreement, and there was a big controversy a few years ago in some aspects of counter-terrorism policy, and the European Parliament is on the map institutionally. Any country which wishes to have an agreement with the European Union has to have a positive vote from the European Parliament. So the role of the Parliament has been growing, and of course since the US Congress is the principal partner, although the EU has partners, of course, around the world, but because of our common history and values, we have a very structured dialogue with the US Congress. And so we have this liaison office, which is housed in the same building as the European Union delegation, which is a new structure. It didn't exist a few years ago, and whereas previously, every 6 months, the presidency country took over the representation of the EU in any particular country. Nowadays, there is an EU delegation appointed by the Vice President of the Commission, the High Representative, currently Baroness Ashton. So that is the face of the European Union in the US. Doesn't mean that the individual member states don't have their part to play. It doesn't mean they don't have differences of opinion. But structurally, that's a very, very important change. And following upon that, and it was partly the previous job that I was doing, following upon that, with the establishment of this new structure, the European Parliament very strongly insisted that within the new structure for common foreign and security policy, there should be a very clear human rights element, not just in terms of words, but also in terms of structures and in terms of action. And for those of you who really want to study the thing carefully, you'll find that in the summer, I think it was in June of this year, the European Union did adopt a very detailed human rights strategy, which covers a whole lot of policy areas and also structural issues. There have always been, shall we say, guidelines for action by the European Union around the world on such issues as the death penalty, support for the International Criminal Court, children's rights, women's rights, LGBTI issues, human rights defenders. But now these guidelines have a structure for them to be implemented. A former minister from Greece has also been appointed as a special representative of the European Union on human rights, a little bit like your Mr. Posner within the State Department, but a face has been given to Europe's aim to project itself on human rights around the world. The structures in Brussels, whereby the member states prepare their activities in relation to human rights, are changing. There is a whole structure for dialogue between the European Union and other countries on human rights issues. There is such a thing as the European Union-United States human rights dialogue, obviously a bit more friendly and possibly more fruitful than the EU-China human rights dialogue. But the US also has a dialogue with China on human rights, so therefore the fact that you have values and you disagree doesn't mean you shouldn't attempt to advance them by every possible means, and dialogue is certainly one of them. I mentioned en passant, as they say, the Helsinki process, where Leonid Brezhnev signed up for human rights and all this kind of stuff, never actually believing that 15 years later his country would collapse under the weight of human rights and demands for democracy. Within the External Action Service, there is a structure, a whole directorate of people whose job it is to work on human rights issues. In every one of the European Union delegations, there is somebody whose job it is to monitor human rights in the country, to engage with civil society, to develop a strategy of support for civil society in a particular country. And they're very, very often those people who are in trouble with the authorities will look to the European Union delegation for support. There's also a substantial financial instrument, the European Initiative for Democracy and Human Rights, which provides assistance to civil society organizations and other bodies of that kind. And most recently, partly inspired by your own National Endowment for Democracy, we have set up, the European Union has set up a European Endowment for Democracy in order to assist countries in the process of democratization. We could probably debate for hours whether Egypt and Poland will end up with the same political system in the future. But the basic idea that you elect your leaders and that they have to respect the law and allow, these require they're not just words, they require structures. And the NED over the years has done its job. And since Europe, many member states of the European Union have rather recent experience of establishing democratic institutions, it is felt that they have something to offer. Not so easy in reality, not just because of differences of culture, religion, and anti-colonialist feelings. Well, why should France teach us in Tunisia about democracy? They used to torture us and occupy us. But still, the structure is there, and it is a sign of the European Union's engagement in that direction. Now, those of you who've been studying the European Union a bit will have noticed that there are a number of institutions. As in your own country, you have a president and a Congress, I've noticed, that don't necessarily sing from the same hymn sheet all the time. Maybe they will just in time for Christmas. So we have a parliament, we have a European Commission, we have a president of the Council, we have the 28 member states working together within the Council, but also with their own substantial areas of sovereignty which remain for them. And so each institution has a specific function. And obviously, the European Commission, is the main executive body. It's the one which implements the funds, which I was referring to. The European Union delegations are the sort of nascent diplomatic service of the European Union, whose job it is to get messages across. And then we also have the institution where I've been working for a few decades, namely the European Parliament, which has substantial powers under the Lisbon Treaty, already had powers over the budget and a great deal of legislation, but most importantly, under the Lisbon Treaty, any country wanting an agreement with the European Union of any kind, whether it's on tracking terrorist financing or whether it's a big global political agreement, so-called partnership and cooperation agreement, that has to be ratified by the European Parliament. And this has turned out to be quite an important opportunity for the Parliament, sometimes to the annoyance of the member states, let alone to the countries concerned, countries such as Russia or China, which would like to have a political agreement with the European Union, know that they're going to have to accept an agreement which includes a human rights clause, and that indeed to get such an agreement ratified by the European Parliament, they have to give some kind of signal that they're moving in the right direction in terms of human rights. An interesting example of common ground, which has struck me in recent months, has been the story of Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer who was basically eliminated in jail in Russia. The European Parliament initiated this call for visa ban on the people who appeared to be responsible for this man's death, and the Congress is at present debating similar legislation. Again, different institutions. The executive in both Brussels and Washington not so keen. But still, that's because we live in complex democratic structures. But it's interesting that even on a specific issue, the same idea should arise. Support for Burma, backing up Aung San Suu Kyi, President Barroso, the European Parliament have visited, President Obama is visiting. These are signs that there is quite a lot of common ground, even if obviously there are difficulties. The European Parliament, the budgetary powers I've mentioned, Parliament also has a very important platform role. I've noticed in Washington you have a similar thing where there are masses of hearings rulings and resolutions which maybe have no immediate consequence, but certainly at a minimum cause annoyance to the countries that are being criticized in any particular resolution, but also give encouragement to those who are risking everything in standing up for their human rights in any particular country. So this is a non-legislative function, but an important one. The observation of elections, an idea pioneered by your very own Jimmy Carter, not very far from here, I believe, or at least I know, in the Carter Center, but the idea of members of parliament from democratic countries observing elections is something which the European Parliament has taken up in a very big way. I couldn't help noticing that there was some controversy in a minority of the United States with regard to the presence of observers from another European or transatlantic organization, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I think they had some troubles in Texas and the rest of it, but I gather when they presented their report that, contrary to what I picked up on one of your better-known TV channels, they were actually allowed to go about their business without too much difficulty. There was a certain amount of rhetoric about these communists from Europe interfering in our democratic system, but in reality they were able to observe that the election took place in a, broadly speaking, correct way in terms of freedom of expression, media access. On the other hand, there were issues of voter registration and the fact that people got stuck outside the polling station, which didn't, shall we say, invalidate the process, as it might do in Russia or Venezuela or somewhere else like that, but did cause some comments to be made. So the European Parliament is very active in that. We have our own office for promoting a parliamentary democracy, since it's a parliament which has many members from newly democratized countries. We have felt that there are lessons which can be shared. And we also have various parliamentary committees which work on human rights, development, foreign affairs, and a specific human rights subcommittee, which it was my job to organize for a few years up until recently. Also on a very public level, but in my experience, one of the most exciting bits of my previous job was precisely the award of the Sakharov Prize each year. Of course, choosing any individual human rights defender and giving them a prize, it's an invidious choice because there are so many. However, in each case, it brings home to you just how enormous are the risks people undertake in Cuba or in Belarus, in Burma, as we mentioned, in Belarus in particular, where so far the efforts have not borne fruit, and as I say, most recently in Iran. And even if this is just a prize, it's just a symbolic act of support. I can assure you there was a whole row with the Iranian government just before the prize was awarded, and they withdrew the visas to a group of MEPs who were about to visit Iran. Similarly, in 2008, when the Parliament gave the prize to a Chinese activist, Hu Jia, similarly there was a little excitement. Of course, the Chinese regime didn't quake in its boots, that somehow the European Parliament, but countries just somehow do not like to be criticized because it challenges their image of themselves. And of course, you don't know, in a country as large as China, I've met people who said, yes, we watched many people watched the ceremony. Now, which was, of course, a pre-recorded message, since the prize winner was in jail at the time. But what does many people mean? But precisely because you're dealing with human rights activists, you're dealing with people who start in a small minority bravely flying the flag for their ideas, which happen to be our ideas too, and you don't know where the result will be. Andrei Sakharov, the prize was named after him when he was down in Gorky, basically cut off, and among the unforgettable professional experiences was looking after his wife, Elena Bonner, when she visited Strasbourg on the 20th anniversary of the prize as a citizen of the Russian Federation. Of course, a country whose democracy is by no means the same as ours, but it is a country which is developing a democratic structure, and therefore you have to always, if you're dealing with something like human rights, by definition, you're dealing with negative situations, and historically, and that I think is the lesson of the European experience, to see the potential for change when people stick up for their own values. Now, finally, I would just like to mention that the Parliament and the other institutions have developed a very active partnership with civil society. The NGOs in Brussels are very, very active to pressurize the institutions. We have, of course, locally, as I mentioned, in each of the EU delegations that have a function to liaise or to be in touch with the local civil society, as well as providing financial support. There is a whole human rights and democracy network organized around Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, because institutions are not just, the members of an institution voting or organizing their hearings. It is also mobilizing public opinion to get your ideas across. So the partnership between something like the European Parliament and the international NGOs is very, very important. And if any of you observe closely the work of the United Nations in New York and Geneva, you'll find that the work of the international NGOs is extremely important. So what are the weaknesses of this approach? One weakness, obviously, is that traditional diplomacy still exists. Compromises still exist. The choices between security, stability, human rights are made day by day by President Obama and by other leaders around the world. The lack of transparency sometimes, when support is being expressed in a particular case, how is it being expressed, what are the consequences? When a dialogue takes place, well, what actually happened? Shouldn't somebody know, apart from diplomats, when human rights are being discussed? But there is also a more fundamental problem, which you face as well, namely the contradiction sometimes between domestic policy and your external policy. Do we really practice what we preach? Now, because we live in societies where it's perfectly normal to criticize and to challenge and to even denounce, let alone in very, very strong terms, during or not during in election periods, we are an open society. I remember precisely at the time when China was very agitated about various actions of the European Parliament, having a discussion with some Chinese diplomats, of course, who were saying, well, why do you criticize us? What about this renditions program of the United States? So I just looked at the chap here and I said, yeah, so how do we know about that? We know about it because America is a free society. You have NGOs, you have a free press, you even have people who don't risk, although they do sometimes, even in your country, risk so much by leaking information. So the public know what's going on, whether they support it, denounce it, change it, as President Obama tried to do, shall we say. It is something which is publicly debated. People don't just disappear, as would happen in many countries around the world. So we have to accept discussion about our own human rights record, whether it's Europe or whether it's the United States. Clearly, the Guantanamo issue remains a very, very controversial one between Europe and the United States. The whole issue of military commissions, drone attacks, which are basically what will be described in legal terms as extrajudicial killings. These are certainly controversial issues, but they're controversial issues which you know about in your country, we know about in Europe. They're not just things that happen and then are just denied. And we have a democratic society where these things can be discussed in the media or in the institutions, because obviously, since we live in free societies, we know perfectly well that these are not perfect societies. We don't assume that democracy is going to produce sort of permanent paradise, so we don't have to entertain this pretense, which perhaps could be considered to be undertaken, for example, at the recent Chinese Party Congress, where they were saying one thing, Not that all is bad in China. Indeed, a lot is much, much better than it's ever been. But the reality of dissent and challenge to the Communist Party rule is there, and yet a front is presented which suits those that are in power. So leading by example should be the goal of the European Union. The structures are there, the commitment is there. I would say the historical record is one that allows Europe to project these values, because we've learned that it is also a matter of something which is proved to be in our own interest. And even if Britain has issues about the euro and political integration, the powers of the institutions, countries such as Britain has no issues on the basic values which the European Union should be enhancing. So the foundation values of democracy and human rights laid down in Article 21 of the Treaty of Lisbon, but I'm more a person of ideas rather than articles. But it is a legal obligation of the European Union to promote these values. And I would say, in spite of the economic difficulties at the present time, the European Union and its institutions should be a little bit more self-confident about the achievements. As I mentioned, the Helsinki process is something which is just often overlooked, that the European countries at the time were saying, well, let's use this and engage with countries to discuss human rights. We don't know where these seeds, or if these seeds will grow, but let's at least have the right to throw them out there into the desert and see what grows. So the European integration process is not, if I may make a prediction, but I'll risk it, is not about to collapse. It may not advance rapidly. It is clearly the case, it's not a discussion about the euro crisis, it's clearly the case that for the euro to succeed, some further political integration is going to be necessary, whether it affects the banking union or the levels of public expenditure. Certain rules are going to have to be stronger at the European level, at least for the countries which have signed up for the euro. So when I read in the Wall Street Journal this morning that Europe's clout is in danger possibly as a result of the recession and the economic crisis and the problems with regard to the euro, I would say yes, but let us not lose a sense of proportion. Let's not forget where the European countries have come from, even in countries, Spain, Italy, which had not so long ago fascist regimes. Of course, you've got challenges to establish political parties. I've studied the whole phenomenon of right-wing extremism, and my preliminary conclusion, if I may say so, is that fascism is not about to come back in Europe. In any country, there are problems, there are difficulties, and they're a huge challenge for democratic institutions. But in fact, the reality of this was brought home to me because I was once invited to give a lecture in a Chinese university, and somebody called me up, as people do, and so what do you want to talk about? Talk about the European crisis and the end of democracy. So I said, fine, I'll do that. It'll be the European crisis and the end of democracy, ? And in the course of my lecture, I accepted that the European Union was in a crisis, but that to decide what to do about it, we have elections to the national parliament, to the European Parliament, and that's how we'll decide how much we're going to spend, just as you're going to decide here how much we're going to spend on social security, defence, foreign assistance, whatever. We won't leave it to the party bosses somewhere to decide at the same time as looking after themselves rather nicely what is in our interest. Yeah, they are tough decisions, but that is what democracy is about. To govern is to choose, they say, but in our society we actually choose the people who do the governing, and even in a time of difficulty such as this, we shouldn't overlook these basic realities. So thank you very much for your attention. Very kind.
So we have about 15 minutes, so Mr. Harris has agreed to entertain questions. So.
Entertain, I don't know, but I'll listen and I'll try and answer. Hi.
My questions might be a bit self
Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent institutions of the European Union are willing or capable of promoting not just human rights, but also the process of individual countries coming to terms with their own past. I'm thinking here of a recent example, Romania, which was in the news a couple of days ago. It's not really been willing to acknowledge, for example, its role in the Holocaust. And one could argue that these types of processes that come to terms with the past are indicative of a country's willingness and ability to adopt and enforce human rights as well. So should the EU be involved in these kind of cultural underpinnings of human rights?
Well, the extent, I mean, certainly I accept your basic premise that in some countries it is remarkable how little people know about their own past. Germany is the biggest exception to this rule, in the sense that every corner of Germany there are pictures and reminders and museums and commemorations of all kind. But in others, it's most of the East European countries, there is very little, shall we say, there may be some documentation about the past, but never, very clear museums or education programs to explain. How far the European Union can be involved in that, in terms of obliging, through some legal action, countries to act in a certain way, that's very, very difficult. The European Parliament has passed resolutions calling for a day of commemoration of the victims of communism, such as we have a Holocaust Memorial Day and things of that kind. And the European Parliament itself is engaged in quite an interesting project, which I hope will be successful, which is to establish alongside the Parliament, which you visited a few months ago, a so-called House of History, which would actually document obviously rather brief way, the origins of the European Union, which, as I say, was dreamed up, if you like, in a period of conflict and destruction. So I think the European Parliament members have, through various actions, encouraged this, but I don't think it's something you could legally oblige. But I certainly agree with you that it is quite surprising how little people know. One of the things which is also surprising, which I pointed out to some of the members of Parliament from time to time, is how little they know about each other's history. How much does a Finn know about Portuguese history? Now, I suppose the average Finn will know there was once a dictatorship in Portugal, and now it's democratic and it's part of Europe. How many Portuguese would know? They're probably vaguely aware that Russia invaded Finland, and there was a very but the lack of awareness of each other's history is quite remarkable. So this project and of the House of History is an interesting one, and moreover, I mentioned the historical moment, the late 1940s. Perhaps one of the problems facing the European Union at the present time is we call it a demographic one, or the question of generational change. For people up until, shall we say, my age, it's fairly logical. Even, as we know, in Britain it's controversial, but it's fairly logical. Well, there was once war and destruction, now we have peace and the European Union. How valid is that argument to the unemployed young person in Spain or in Italy bearing the brunt of unpopular austerity measures which appear to be being dictated from Europe? That remains to be seen. So it is certainly a challenge, and I would only say as a more historical observation rather than institutional one, memories are revived at different times. Now, the fact that now there's not much in Romania, although there is actually a small museum in Bucharest, but you took that by way of example. One of the best actually is in Latvia. There's a fantastic historical museum there. Is that you don't know when these historical memories are going to come back. Even the state of Israel, the first decades, they didn't have much time to sort of create museums, and they just knew there'd been something terrible, and now they had Israel. I think it will be a permanent process. Indeed, history, I wouldn't say is always being rewritten, but certainly as a new generation emerges, forget about whether it's the fault of Baroness Ashton or Mr. Van Rompuy. By and large, they're all part of the same generation. The issue is the generation who are, the emerging leaders, and in 20, 30, 40 years, that's the real test. I don't think it's, whether in a moment of crisis of the euro, the whole thing is going to collapse. It's not so much that, it's how relevant the historical lessons of the 1940s and then communist period will remain in the future. That's very, very difficult, and if people don't face up to it, but whether they should face up to it institutionally as opposed to by books and universities and memoirs, it's a matter of opinion. Sure.
You mentioned about the controversial issues on Guantanamo Bay. I was wondering what the stance of the EU on the balance between national security and human rights. In my home country, South Korea, we have also a national security law, which can punish people who express their sympathy for North Korea. And politicians use that law to against the opponent parties often.
Well, that is a vast subject. What I would say is, in terms of how the European Union is organized itself, there is, within the Treaty of Lisbon, based on the Treaty of Amsterdam, a whole structure for justice and home affairs, freedom, security and justice, as it's now called. Within the European Parliament, there is a human rights subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but there is also a committee on civil liberties as well. And indeed, the European Parliament, alongside the Council of Europe, was one of those which really brought to public attention the role of European governments in cooperating in the renditions program, which was ended by the current president. The issues of balance between national security and human rights are issues which by and large are settled in our countries by the law. I mean, we haven't got such a strong national security apparatus as you appear to have in the US. Obviously, I'm not aware of everything that goes on, but I think there's a lot less of these issues of internal eavesdropping, renditions, military commissions. I'm not aware of anything of that kind in any member state of the European Union, because a lot of that would be secret anyway. But so by and large, issues such as that have come up in the courts, sometimes with controversies, even the issue of returning, sending prisoners who are suspected of terrorism in their own country back to Jordan or even to the United States have proved quite controversial. But by and large, the structure for the protection of citizens' rights is quite advanced, and indeed some people consider that it's too advanced in our country. But basically, the answer has been that for the European countries, it's not up to me to say about the United States, the protection against terrorism includes respecting national laws, which in terms of citizens' rights are in fact also European laws at the same time. And so there are many, many court cases, many embarrassing revelations, particularly following the overthrow of the Libyan regime. Lots of interesting documents came to light about interrogation of British citizens who'd found themselves in Libya, having been picked up somewhere or other and handed over to the Gaddafi regime. So we have our share of contradictions as well. But by and large, the answer to your question is that we have a legal structure, and the philosophy is, if anything, that's where criticism comes about, sometimes very much tilted in favor of the citizens' rights.
I was wondering how the EU works through the UN to propagate human rights. What's the relationship?
Well, there's various things. Very briefly, there's a substantial financial support by the European Union to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, because the UN needs money to function. Indeed, some Americans wanted to stop paying precisely for that reason. The European Union countries, because it's not a state, the European Union as countries which play their full part in the Human Rights Council. There is a special office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights based in Brussels. Many of the European Union's aid programs are geared towards specific United Nations projects. But as I say, now that the American administration takes a similar approach of engagement with the United Nations, I think there's a fair amount of cooperation. But basically, the idea is that the United Nations should be stronger. That would pass and will pass, no doubt, sometime in this century by a reform of the Security Council. But for the time being, the Security Council works as it does, and the European Union does not have a seat there as an individual member or within the United Nations as such. There are those who argue that it should. Shall we say it's a discussion. It seems a little bit of a remote possibility at the present time, but having the Euro, or having the European Union, or democratically elected European Parliament would have seemed a pretty remote possibility. So it's an argument. It would depend a bit on the successors of Baroness Ashton, whether the prestige of the European foreign minister grows. Then the idea of Europe speaking with a single voice and a single representative within the United Nations will gather support. But by definition, the balances between the European institutions and the national institutions leaves us in the current situation.
Well, thank you very much. I'm aware that it is class. It's time to move on to your next classes. I just realized that. So thank you all for coming. And once again, thanks to Amy Henry, who's now with us, Executive Director of International Education, and her staff at the Office of International Education for a wonderful week of events celebrating International Education Week. And special thanks to Mr. Geoffrey Harris for ending this week and with a very informative and important discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.